Now, sometimes Christian apologists will point out this fact and will stress it in what I think is an inappropriate way by saying that since the New Testament is better documented than any other book from the ancient world, therefore we can trust it. That's a real leap in logic. The fact that we have more manuscripts of the New Testament than any other book, for one thing, that makes sense, because who was copying books in the Middle Ages? Monks. What are they going to be copying? They're going to be copying the Scriptures. And so, of course we have more manuscripts of the Bible than anything else. But apart from that, the fact that we have so many manuscripts of the New Testament doesn't mean that you can trust the New Testament. It simply means that in most places, you know what the New Testament originally said. That's not the same thing as saying that what it says is right. See what I mean? I mean, just suppose theoretically we could establish what Plato really said in his book, The Republic. Well, that wouldn't mean that you could trust the Republic. It would just mean you know what Plato wrote. The fact that you have these manuscripts simply shows that the New Testament is better attested than other books from the ancient world. The oldest manuscripts of the New Testament that we have, the very oldest fragments, are pretty old. The oldest fragment we have is a little credit card-sized fragment of the Gospel of John that has verses from John chapter 18, the trial before Pilate, written on the front and the back. So it was originally a full manuscript, and it was thrown away in a trash heap in a place called Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, and just over the years it wore out, and so all that's left is this little fragment, and it has some verses from the trial before Pilate in John chapter 18. This fragment is called P52 because it was the 52nd papyrus manuscript that was discovered and cataloged, and it's very important. For one thing, it's important because it's written on the front and the back, which means that this came not from a scroll, but from a book. The way we have books today, where you write on both sides of the page and then you bind them together. That's how Christians apparently originally wrote their books, as opposed to using scrolls like everybody else did, at least according to our earliest manuscript. So our oldest manuscript, this P52, probably dates sometime in the early 2nd century. Maybe around the year 120, 130, something like that. That's just 30 or 40 years after the Gospel of John was written. So that's pretty good if you can get back within 30 or 40 years. But what it means is that the Gospel of John had been copied for 30 or 40 years by hand before we have any scrap of it that survives. And we don't have a complete Gospel of John until about a century after that. Most of these 5,700 manuscripts we have are not early 2nd century. Most of them, in fact, come from the Middle Ages. The vast majority of them come from starting the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries and onward down to the invention of printing. Once the printing press was invented in the 15th century, that did not stop people from copying the New Testament books or any other books by hand. Just like the invention of the personal computer and word processors did not mean that typewriters just absolutely disappeared. There are people who use number 2 pencils still. You say, well, why? Well, you've got a personal computer. Well, they had printing presses, but they still copied manuscripts by hand as well until the whole thing took over sometime later. So we have lots of manuscripts. They range in dates from the 2nd century down to the 15th or 16th centuries. How many mistakes are found in these manuscripts of the New Testament that we have? This was a question that did not trouble people throughout the Middle Ages. It didn't seem to trouble the scribes who were copying their texts, or if it did trouble them, they don't say very much about it. It did begin to be troubling to scholars about 300 years ago. In fact, exactly 300 years ago, in the year 1707, there was a scholar who produced an edition of the Greek New Testament that caused a bit of an uproar because of what he found. So 1707, the New Testament had been put in printed form for nearly 200 years at this point. When printers were deciding what form of the text to print, they took older manuscripts, handwritten copies, and they decided which ones to put in movable type, and so print their manuscripts like that. And that was fine. And so for 200 years, there were copies of the New Testament in print based on manuscripts. But scholars started realizing that these manuscripts that the printed texts were based on were different from one another. And in 1707, the floodgates opened. There was a scholar at Oxford named John Mill. This guy, I think, is unrelated to the Victorian John Stuart Mill. John Mill, 1707, spent about 30 years looking at manuscripts of the New Testament in order to see where they differed from one another. He had access to about 100 manuscripts, and he read these manuscripts carefully and compared them line by line, verse by verse, to see where the differences were. And then he printed a copy of the Greek New Testament where he gave a line of the text, and at the bottom of this page, he gave places where he found differences among the manuscripts. Okay, so he gave an apparatus including the differences he found among his manuscripts. To the shock and dismay of many of his readers, John Mill's apparatus contained 30,000 places of variation among the manuscripts. 30,000 places where the surviving manuscripts he examined differed from one another. Some of John Mill's detractors were outraged and claimed that he was attempting to render the text of Scripture uncertain. His supporters pointed out that he didn't invent these 30,000 places of variation. He simply noticed that they exist, so it's not exactly his fault. But that started people wondering, well, exactly how many differences are there? And if there are all these differences, how do we know what the authors originally wrote? Well, that was 300 years ago when John Mill examined 100 manuscripts, and as I pointed out, we have something like 57 times as many manuscripts today. So how many differences are there among our manuscripts? Scholars have different estimates. The reality is nobody knows because nobody's been able to count them all, even with the developments of computer technology. Some scholars say that there are 200,000 differences in our manuscripts, or 300,000, or 400,000. The way I put it to my students usually is in comparative terms. There are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. That's a lot of differences. Now, I should say at the outset that these thousands and thousands of differences, most of them are completely unimportant, insignificant, immaterial, and don't matter for anything. Many of these differences you cannot even replicate in a translation. There are slight differences in Greek that you can't even replicate when you translate it into English. By far and away, the most common difference among the manuscripts shows nothing more than that scribes in the ancient world could spell no better than people can today. And scribes, of course, didn't have spell check. They didn't even have dictionaries. And scribes, in fact, some scribes didn't even care how they spelled words. Sometimes you'll be reading a manuscript and you'll have the same word within a few lines and the word will be spelled 3 different ways. So the scribes just didn't care often how spelled. And so that's the kind of change that really doesn't matter for anything. There are other changes that matter that I'm going to get to in a second. I'm going to categorize the changes we have in our manuscripts under 2 rubrics. First, there are changes that I would call accidental mistakes, where scribes just blew it. They were inept. They weren't trained, they were tired, they were inattentive, and something happened. Somebody sneezed in the room, they didn't hear the word right, and they wrote down the wrong word. I mean, something happened, and they just made mistakes. For example, the misspellings is a good example of that. Or scribes commonly would leave out a word. You know, they're copying a page, and they've got a manuscript from them they're copying. They look at the page, they see the word, they write down the word, their eye goes back to the page, and they skip a word. Because their eyes are going back to the page and they just skip a word, and so they leave out a word. That happened a lot. One of the ways this happened frequently was when 2 lines of a text, two subsequent lines would end in the same words. For example, in Luke chapter 12, verses 8 and 9, Jesus says, "Whoever confesses me before humans will be confessed before the angels of God. But whoever denies me before humans will be denied before the angels of God." Okay, so before the angels of God ends 2 lines. Now, a number of scribes, as it turns out, copied down the words before the angels of God, the first instance, but when their eye came back to the page, their eye came to the second instance, and they thought those were the words they had just copied. And so they continued then to the 3rd line, and inadvertently then left out the 2nd line. See how that works? That kind of phenomenon where your eye skips a line, the technical term for that is parablepsis. When two lines end the same way, it's called homoteleuton. And so this kind of mistake, I tell my students at Chapel Hill, is parablepsis occasioned by homoteleuton. In case you wondered. Sometimes scribes simply made mistakes, and sometimes the mistakes are virtually beyond belief. There's one 10th century manuscript that's called Manuscript 109. It's called 109 because it was the 109th manuscript to be discovered and cataloged. 109 is a very interesting manuscript because it's a copy of the Gospel of Luke. And the scribe who was copying the Gospel of Luke came to Jesus' genealogy. Now, you know, in the genealogy of Jesus, it's in Luke's Gospel, Luke has this amazing genealogy. Now, my students don't like genealogies because they're kind of boring, you know, so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so, you know, and you go on like this. And I tell them, look, you know, these genealogies in the New Testament, you know, they're nothing. They go on for half a chapter. If you want a genealogy, go to the Hebrew Bible, 1 Chronicles, 9 chapters. Genealogies. So these aren't quite as bad as, but Luke is especially interesting because it traces Jesus. It says Jesus was supposedly the son of Joseph, the son of Jacob, the son of Mathat, the son of Heli, and so. And it goes all the way back. You know, the son of Solomon, the son of David, goes on back. The son of Abraham, the son of goes on, and it ends up with Adam, as in Adam and Eve. Okay, so I have an aunt who's a genealogist who is very proud of, you know, tracing our family line back to the Mayflower. The Mayflower, Adam and Eve. This is a serious genealogy, and so it traces. And then when it gets back to son of Seth, son of Adam, then it says the Son of God. So the Jesus genealogy goes back to God. This is a great genealogy. So the scribe of Manuscript 109 is copying the genealogy from a copy. The copy that he was copying apparently gave the genealogy in two columns, and the second column didn't go all the way down to the bottom of the page. And the scribe of 109 inadvertently thought that he was to copy the genealogy not one column at a time, but across the columns. And since it ends in the middle of the middle of that column, some very interesting results attain. As it turns out, instead of Adam, it's Phares who is the father of the human race, and God is the son of Aram. So sometimes scribes just weren't paying attention. There are other changes in our manuscripts where it looks like scribes were paying full attention and knew fully well what they were doing and changed the text because they thought it ought to be changed, either because they thought somebody before them had made a mistake or because they wanted to straighten out some other problem. I'll give you a couple of examples. The Gospel of Mark, our earliest gospel, begins by saying, just as is written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I send my messenger before your face who will prepare your way. Okay, very famous passage in Isaiah the prophet. The problem is this quotation from Scripture does not come from Isaiah. It comes from Exodus and Malachi. Scribes copying this, and they got to this bit about it being from Isaiah, and they knew full well it didn't come from Isaiah. So what are they to do? Well, in later medieval manuscripts, the text is changed. In these later medieval manuscripts, it says, just as is written in the prophets, behold, I am sending my messenger before your face. See, it's getting rid of a potential problem of saying that a passage comes from Isaiah when it doesn't. So I think whoever did that probably just didn't do it by accident. Probably somebody did it on purpose. Or I'll give you a second example. The one instance in the New Testament where you have a story of Jesus as a boy occurs in Luke chapter 2. You know the story. Jesus is a 12-year-old, and they've gone to Jerusalem for a festival, and his parents have gone back in the caravan thinking that he's with them, but in fact he's not with them. He's back in Jerusalem. And then they realize after they've started the trip that he's not there, so they go back and try and find him. And after 3 days, Mary finds him in the temple. That, by the way, is not an accident, that it's on the third day that she finds him. Right? This is foreshadowing Jesus' appearance on the third day at his resurrection. See, it's foreshadowing at the beginning what's going to happen at the end. But anyway, Mary shows up and she finally finds Jesus in the temple, and she's upset. And she says, "Son, why have you treated us this way? Your father and I have been upset, looking all over for you." Your father and I? Scribes thought that this was very peculiar because they knew Jesus was not Joseph's son. Joseph was not the father of Jesus. Why would Mary say, "Your father and I"? And so scribes changed the text.